So, good afternoon, everybody. It's me again, Paul Woodadge, here for WW2TV, and what we're labeling the third part of our Operation Aquatint series, although in fact we're going to branch off and talk about escape and evasion in France generally. And I've got two guests for you today. I'll introduce the one I've known the longest, the first. So Nigel is a fellow tour guide in Normandy. I've known Nigel 20 years. Nigel Stewart is an artist, a lecturer, photographer. Good afternoon, Nigel.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on board.
And Nigel did the cover painting for my Angels of Mercy book back 7 years ago now. I'll just put that up on the screen there. So Nigel, that's one of Nigel's artistic efforts there. That was the cover of my book. So that was good. So thank you, Nigel, for that. And my other guest is Dr. Fry, prolific author of all things intelligence and spies and behind the lines and interrogations and all those kind of exciting things. Good afternoon, Helen. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good afternoon from London.
So essentially where we left off with the first two shows, the first show, Aquatint, we filmed on the beach. And Aquatint, for those who are watching, reminding you, was a raid by the small-scale raiding force into Normandy that ended up landing on what we came later Omaha Beach, and it was 12 commandos or so, and they all went badly wrong. And we did that first show from the German point of view, so the German archives of how they reacted to seeing this craft off the shore and spotlights and machine gun fire. And we had Duncan down there on the beach, and Duncan's great uncle was part of the raid on the MTB. That was part one, and the link to that show is in the description below. Part two, we had the incredible Damien Lewis on, talking about the small-scale raiding force as part of the evolution, if you like, of commando forces developed by the British post Churchill's orders to set Europe ablaze. And we talked about how that came about. And this third show is about the aftermath of the operation. Now, what's interesting, and I'll just go on, don't do too much about this, is that there is still some debate as to exactly what the whole purpose of Operation Aquatint was intended for, and suggestions they were trying to steal some plans, Atlantic Wall and things like that. But anyway, it went wrong. Three members of the party died on the beach. The rest either escaped or evaded capture, and some of them had pretty horrible ends. And Nigel will be talking about one of those participants later on. But before we get into that, we want to talk about the development, if you like, of what Allied soldiers were told to do if they found themselves behind the lines, unable to go back to their units. And that's where Helen's going to come in on this. So, Helen, it all kind of starts post Dunkirk, isn't it? Immediately when the BEF is rescued from France, we leave behind thousands of British soldiers, and then there are so exactly how does, because I should have mentioned for folks that Helen's latest book, which is behind her there, and I've got a copy of it. I'll just there, MI9, all about this, which is, I think, one of the best cover designs ever. But I'm a former printer in a previous life, and I just love the cover. It's a cracking. I could just look at the cover all day, forget the words. The cover's great. But so post Dunkirk, we know the Allies that we've got to look at trying to help and assist downed airmen, escaping soldiers to get back to the UK, basically. So give us a little rundown of how that kind of process began and the key steps, if you like.
Yes, so that MI9 is really a forgotten secret service of the Second World War, and its brief was in escape and evasion. And although it was founded in December 1939, of course, as you mentioned, the first real challenge comes after Dunkirk, because a staggering 50,000 men were left behind. They couldn't be evacuated. And, around 5,000 of them were actually in hiding. So those that could made it to the south of France, to Marseille, and that's where one of the escape lines was founded. But it became very challenging, and MI9 was determined to bring back all of those personnel, and they succeeded in all but 300 of them, according to the files. So a lot of those 50,000 went into prisoner of war camps. They were transported to Germany, but MI9 did get them back. And I think what is extraordinary about MI9 is its philosophy of escape-mindedness, and this will become relevant when we talk about Aquatint and the other raids and the aftermath of that.
Absolutely. And there's obviously a progression and development of techniques, things like that. And, I did a show with Sarah Megan Thomas on last week about the Your Call to Spy film, and we're not going to go down the SOE rabbit hole because that's another whole subject. But the MI9 they're a brand new organization, so there aren't previous bosses they can talk to. There aren't previous archives. It's kind of on the job learning, where there's the odd person who escaped in World War I that they can kind of draw on, but it's all the very men who get back from France are then taken aside and said, right, what have you learned? What did you do that was good? What shouldn't you do? And, you know, I was reading in your book last night that comment about the fact they were kind of told in 1940 that 95% of French people are kind of behind the Allied effort. And you think, well, that's great, except it's a bit black and white. Yeah. And as I do living in France and understanding the occupation, although the occupation was just beginning in May, June 1940, you know, just assuming you can trust every French person is perhaps a little bit naive, and so they have to invent all these rules. So when we let's skip through the first couple of years. I know we could talk about what's happening in 1941, but let's bring it up to 1942, because the whole thing about Operation Aquatint is that the previous raid by the one of the previous raids by the small scale raiding forces into Sark, and it was the Sark raid that we think is the trigger for the Germans to issue the notorious Commando Order. So Helen, run through exactly what the Commando Order was, and folks, Helen told me something about the Commando Order I didn't know. If I did know, I'd forgotten. So Helen, explain what that was and how that would have been completely a game changer, effectively, wasn't it?
Yes, it was a game changer, and it was something which really worried the British intelligence services, and in particular MI9, because the Commando Order, Hitler was so enraged by some of, well, even if they weren't successful raids, certainly with Dieppe, that we actually snatched prisoners and took them back and got intelligence from them. So we realised that even if they were a failed raid, which of course Aquatint goes on to do, and interestingly in my research, I did discover that one of the main reasons for Aquatint was to snatch guards, personnel, to bring them back, to interrogate them, to find out what, you know, about the coastal defences, because of course we had an eye on the evasion eventually on the landings. So yeah, the Commando Order, Hitler was so enraged that he issued this order that these commanders were to be killed. They were not to be taken as prisoners of war. As such, they were not bound by the Geneva Convention. They were almost to be treated as spies, I suppose, in the same way as if spies were captured. But one of the terrifying things that happened was Hitler's commander in Norway, General von Falkenhausen, he actually added an addendum to that order and said that anyone who captures commandos or special forces of the Allies, they should not survive for more than 24 hours. And that was, he was done for war crimes at the end of the war. For that, they proved him guilty. So it wasn't even as though those commandos had been taken off and they had a chance to escape. If they were given an order, you know, if the Germans had been given an order, they should kill them within 24 hours. You know, it's just a game changer.
It is, but it's also counterintuitive from the German point of view, is because, as we'll go on later on, Nigel starts talking about one of the Aquatint survivors, is that the Germans by 42 are actually starting to break into the various escape lines, aren't they? In fact, there are entire lines that have been broken by this point, and they're actually maybe almost winning the battle. When we talk about U-boat wars, we talk about the happy times, don't we? And I would class the kind of late 42 period for the Germans as kind of a happy time, in the sense of they are actually breaking as fast as we are establishing the various lines. So if you're now killing commandos you've just captured, you're not going to break. You're not going to. You've killed that one guy, sure, but you're not going to find out who his contacts were. You're not going to find out where he's meant to be going. So, do you think Hitler's order actually pissed off the Abwehr and intelligence people, because it's going against what they're trying to do? Does that make any sense? Am I rambling now?
No, I think, you know, it is interesting. One thing that's always puzzled me is that how totally, I suppose is the word inefficient correct, how the German intelligence service was nowhere near as sophisticated or as subtle as our intelligence services. And, you know, for a machine that was just so, you know, militarily yeah, it was hard to be up against Germany, and of course when they're developing the V weapons and all that kind of stuff, and all the other technological stuff that they're developing, you think, you know, they haven't got their intelligence service, you know, they're not screwed on with regard to that. And that always, I always worried about that, you know, why, you know, if we missed something. But of course, one thing they did do in France around this time, and it happens just a couple of months after Aquatint, they were very good at breaking up the escape lines, devastating it, but it's the human side of the intelligence. They were very good at picking off well, one of MI9's agents, famous Harold Cole, and turning him. So, and then he would infiltrate the lines with fake airmen. So the Abwehr were good at that, but on the other hand, they, as you said, they killed off their sources. So it just doesn't make sense.
I mean, yeah, I mean, we get the whole, when you're discussing World War II generally, there's lots of points you arrive at it doesn't make any sense when the Germans are doing what they're doing, because so much of their operations invading Russia, for goodness sake, doesn't make any sense at all. But anyway, let's go. So by 1942, so we've had units like the small scale raiding force are up and running. We've had various things into Norway. There's been the Operation Biting, the raid into Bruneval to get the bits of radar in February 42. So from what MI9 had learnt in the earlier part of the war, the guys getting back from Dunkirk and the various airmen getting back, and I said we'll kind of skip over that 2 years of development in some ways, but by let's say the summer of 1942, what would MI9 be briefing a commando mission, or indeed what would they be briefing RAF units, pilots, and would they be briefed on the same thing? I mean, we'd learned some techniques, but let's start with a commando unit. What do you think they would be told about what to do if something goes wrong?
Yeah, so by and large, I think the first thing to say is that many people don't realise that commandos were given a briefing by MI9 before they went into action. Right. I think probably you and I take that for granted, but it's not actually widely known. And MI9 had a 3-week training programme, which was largely largely the same, but slightly modified, as you say, for the commando raids. And in particular, depending on where the raid was, they would have maps and scenarios on how they could get out and go into hiding. So number one thing that they were told was, and it all sounds very obvious, do not be captured. But MI9, again, it's psychology, realized that if you've been on a very dangerous raid like the Aquatint raid, you're disorientated after capture, perhaps you've been under fire, people might not, or the men might not realize or think logically. And so MI9 instilled the training into them so that it was natural, and it was all about evading capture. So that was the same for airmen as well as for the commandos. Certainly in the Operation Frankton, and I know we can't go down that route today, but they were given a specific route out. They were to head for Rufek afterwards, and only 2 of them made it out. And they were to link up with the SIS escape lines as it happened. But in that part of France, in northern France there, they were to evade capture and to wait for someone of the escape line to find them. Because it was, although, as we said, MI9 reckoned that 95% of the French were sympathetic, because they were under occupation, you couldn't always be totally sure who those other 5% were. And so largely women were thought to be okay, wives of farmers, and if the men were off fighting, but primarily they were to evade capture and to go into hiding. And again, MI9 gave them tips on how to blend into the background. So simple things which we might like think, oh, but how to walk in a French way or not in a British way, to acquire a beret, just subtle things which meant that if they had to move from place to place, they could blend in. So I hope that's helpful.
About the walk, because me and Nigel, our friends Colin and Doug, we're all Brits here, and our French guiding friends say they can spot us from hundreds of yards away at Point du Hoc places because of our walk. We all walk in a particularly British way, apparently, and it's like, I don't know what it is I'm doing that gives me away as being British, but it's something they're saying. But I'm conscious of the fact we haven't brought Nigel a bit now. So let's bring it to Operation Aquatint. And the particular gentleman we're going to talk about is Graham Hayes. So Nigel, just briefly, who is Graham Hayes? What's his background? And then we'll talk about his initial kind of response to the Operation Aquatint going wrong. But who was he to begin with?
Okay, well, Graham was, along with Geoffrey Appleyard, from Linton on Wharf in North Yorkshire, and he'd been involved in the development of SSRF when March Phillips had developed the teams at Anderson Manor, and they'd gone on the Postmaster raid. And come Aquatint, he's one of the people that were going to come ashore on the night of Saint Laurent, the night of 12th to the 13th. There he is.
Yeah.
Smoking his pipe. De Grange. The Frenchman. Lassen, of course, who was...
Lassen, who didn't do the raid, yeah.
Night. Howard. And he is amongst those that came ashore, and maybe should we pick it up to where they were trying to get back to the Goatley?
Yeah, I'll show a little map as well. I could have printed. I got a Google image of the aerial image. So explain. So we think they meant the Operation Aquatint was supposed to go to Saint-Honorine-des-Pères. They ended up in Saint Laurent-sur-Mer, right in the middle of what we now call Omaha Beach, near the monument. And he tried to. Well, I'll let you tell the story. I'll put the image up, the Google image up. So explain about how he gets back or tries to go back.
Well, it looks like from the accounts that all of them, apart from Hall, who had been very badly wounded on the beach, were trying to get back to the Goatley, or had got back on it. I'm not sure. Survival was kicking in at this point, I would think. This must be around about 2:30 a.m.
Yeah,
pitch black, no moonlight. The MTB 344 was out of sight. Gunfire was raining down on them. It sounds like from what you read that the Goatley capsized, and they start swimming westwards towards away from the gunfire that was hitting the Goatley, which had capsized, and the MTB was out of sight anyway. So you're not going to head north. You're not going to head into the channel, and I would think the adrenaline is what's keeping them going at this point with all the emotions. Hayes, by the accounts, had to let go of March Phillips, who lost consciousness in the water. Was trying to save him. So at this point, he's trying to just save himself. Removes all his heavy equipment and starts swimming with the others that are able to, swimming or drifting east-westwards. They're probably doing a combination of the two. I think the tide was going out, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was going out.
And as we know, the currents are strong there, and he's going westwards. It's difficult to know for how long. And said to have come onto the shore, combination of swimming and drifting with the current, in the vicinity of Hamel-au-Pret.
Yeah.
And he remarks, there are accounts later that he remarked on having got across the beach, having stripped himself of all heavy equipment, by finding a passageway up the slopes around the vicinity of Hamel-au-Pret, which you wonder with a little bit of you do wonder if that's the famous Côte d'Or or not.
Could be Côte d'Or, couldn't it? Somewhere around there, yeah. It's sort of halfway. Those who've been to Normandy, it's that kind of halfway down between Dog Green and Dog White.
Got feeling it's that area anyway.
Yeah.
And he starts to head inland, away from what's been happening on the beach. Now, I would assume that he's going to have received instruction and training to just get away as far as possible from any incident that's gone badly wrong. You're not going to stay to roads. I'm assuming he's got a compass and silk map. In fact, Isabel de Brunville, who we'll come to shortly, referred to keeping some artifacts that he'd left that she had to burn later. I'll come back to that. And he heads southwards, and he moves. He's going to have to think about getting somewhere before daylight.
Yeah,
it's a pitch black night, no moonlight. He's going to be using fields and hedgerows, which, of course, if you're avoiding roads, is not easy. And he ends up in Anier, which is about 3 miles.
Yeah, and we'll bring Helen in a minute. And even looking at that Google image, because for folks, my mouse is kind of basically the route he would have taken. He ends up here somewhere and goes off sort of west and south, ends up here. The chateau he ended up is here.
Yeah,
which does seem to avoid
going into
major
villages.
roads.
Yeah.
Now, when we were standing there, because we were going to be, if we hadn't had lockdown, the idea was Nigel was going to be at Anier Chateau and filming from there, but of course that's not possible. But I'm going to bring Helen in now because we're kind of speculating. He's the first thing he's going to do, Helen, with it is get away from the immediate danger, isn't it? That would be surely their first training is get as far away as you can. And then start thinking, you don't want to be hanging around 100 meters away from where the actions happen, because that's where any kind of German net is going to close in immediately around you. So the key thing is to get distance, isn't it? So 3 or 4 miles seems completely reasonable. Do you think he would have been told to avoid road? Do you think the Aquatint men would have been given some kind of a clue as to where to go, or what's your gut?
Well, what's interesting, I mean, I'm intrigued by this discussion because I haven't seen the MI9 briefing for the Aquatint raid. It would be fascinating. I'm not sure that it's been declassified. They had a know for sure. They also had a briefing ahead of Dieppe, and that is specifically mentioned in the files. But what isn't mentioned is the precise nature of that briefing. And it could just be because it was basic kind of a briefing that could be used for any raid, and therefore from a security point of view, for some reason it's still not there. But I don't remember, and those are the kind of things that I always find fascinating that I would have remembered and would have worked on. So the actual commando briefings themselves, but we do know that they had models and maps of the regions, and Nigel's right, they would have had an escape map and a compass, tiny miniature compass. But I don't remember again seeing anything specific about keeping away from the roads. The fact that he didn't may be that MI9, because of the region, had given them that specific briefing beforehand to keep away from the roads. But that area is probably one of the hardest to escape from, because of the, it's heavily fortified. You've got a lot of troops, well, I say troops, well, guards and patrols potentially, and patrols with dogs. I mean, I think his chances of survival are pretty slim.
It is kind of the lull before the storm, because we're talking September 42. So the Atlantic Wall is only in its kind of first phase. So it was going to get worse. I mean, a year later, there'd have been even more Germans around. Of course, if anyone's who's traveled around Normandy, in the middle of the night, there are miles and miles of back roads where you're just not, there's no way the Germans could have enough people to be patrolling every one of those little back lanes. La Manche, which is the next department over, I always like to quote, has the second longest amount of roads in any department in France, because every village to every other village, there's like 4 different routes that run parallel through hedgerows. So there's an awful lot of places to go. But when Nigel and I were standing there, we were kind of speculating, because he moves very fast. I mean, the raid, the Aquatint goes wrong at something like 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. Okay. And he's 3 or 4 miles away within a few hours. So he's not sprinting, but he's certainly not hanging about. And he ends up, and I'll let Nigel take care of it. He ends up sort of in this little village Vanier. And what we don't know, and I guess we'll never know, is whether he knew he was going there, whether it was instinct that took him there, or whether luck or whatever. But he does end up, kind of bumping into the right person. I'll let Nigel carry on with the story now, then we'll bring you back in again, Helen. So he ends up in Anier, doesn't he, Nigel? Anier.
He does, yeah. Obviously, it looks like he skirted the village itself, which is a small one of about 65 population now. And he arrived at the farm, which is directly opposite the chateau he ended up in. And Graham apparently spoke very little French, if any at all, just pidgin French. And it's the farm of, it's the chateau, We've got the picture, Paul, of the view of the farm from the chateau.
The view of the farm from the
Chateau towards farm.
Yeah, here we go. There we are.
There you go. Okay, got to thank Carl and Sabine for these pictures. They're the owners of the chateau today, nowadays.
Carl is Swedish,
so
adding another whole dimension of nationalities to normally. He's a Swedish chef living there, but yeah, great.
That's the entrance to the chateau, looking towards the farm of Michel Lemasson, and it was still dark apparently when Michel Lemasson. Everybody was awake that night from all the noise that had come from the coast. Michel Lemasson there was a knock at the door, and apparently Lemasson related later, Graham introduced himself as Graham Hayes, British officer, which
very brave.
One can imagine. And you know, did Graham know where he was or not? I don't know.
Actually, that's interesting. May I just interject,
yeah,
Nigel?
sure.
Because you know, we're dealing with the MI9 history. There's just the sheer volume of information, but I recognise this location from my research, and I've looked. I can't find anything instantly, but you know how sometimes, certainly post D-Day, my hunch, and it would need more research, is that in their case they may have been told to head towards a particular safe house. They weren't allowed to write anything down, even before or afterwards. So I'm just thinking that name rings a bell. So it could be that in their case they knew where they were to head for a particular area. But it's interesting that they were told, you know, he ends up at the farmhouse, because by and large farmers' families were pro-Allied, not always, but yeah. Sorry,
well,
so I thought that might be helpful. But I do recognise
this is exactly what he wanted to do. Is so he gets there, doesn't he, Nigel? So
he does. There was one known, as far as I know, it's one. There might be others, but there is definitely one member of the resistance, the Alliance Network, who was in Anya. It was the blacksmith, Andre. I forget his name. Anne. His surname was Anne. He was one of those that was sent to the Con prison and shot later on D-Day.
Yeah.
The blacksmith. So you know there was a connection in the village with the resistance. Whether or not Lemasson knew of that or not, I don't know. But Lemasson gave Hayes had fallen well anyway. He was given food and shelter. It looks like Lemasson waited until nightfall on the 13th.
Yeah, the next day.
To go across to the chateau to see Paul de Branville, who was the mayor of the village, the neighbouring chateau. And so that's Paul de Branville with his and Jeanne, his mother, with Isabel. Isabel, who would later join the Jean-Marie Donkeyman network later. I'll come back to that. There's also a son called Olivier. I'll come into the story in a moment. Paul, the mayor, agreed to take. That's right. Lemasson had seen him during the day, but Paul had agreed to take Hayes across to the chateau that evening, come nightfall. Apparently, they missed the German patrol by about 150 yards, getting Hayes across. But they didn't put him into the chateau. They put him into the neighbouring barn, which is just to the side of
this one here, isn't it? Yeah,
that's the one in the loft, in the hay barn, in the hay loft. And they gave him a change of clothes, removed all of his anything relating to the SASRF and any of his military equipment that he was carrying, and he was put to rest basically. And until things died down a little bit, because of course by this point, even if there weren't a lot of German troops behind the beach at that point, there would have been heavily patrolling the area after what had just happened.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Paul de Branville, and it looks like Paul de Branville, the mayor, was in knowledge of a network connection, because he sent his son Olivier, I presume by bicycle. We'll movement in those days would have been. This is the forbidden area, of course, coastal area, down to the Bayeux Road. His son on the 14th, they didn't waste any time, went to see a friend of Paul de Brandeville's in Huemonde, which is south of Bayeux, so it's about a 2-hour bicycle ride. There's no reference to a car being used, which of course were rare. And on the 14th, so Olivier went to visit Septime Human, who was an insurance broker in Huemonde, south of Bayeux. Olivier described to him the situation, who was hiding with them in the chateau. And Olivier came back on the 14th in the evening to tell his father that Hayes was to be taken by Olivier the next morning on the 15th to the Bayeux train station and be taken to Lisu, where he would be put into a safe house. Okay. Hayes, Olivier and Isabel spoke English. They gave details to Graham Hayes of Septime Human's physical appearance, as they had done to Septime Graham's physical appearance. Graham, of course, did have a very British look about him as well, with his moustache. And the next day, on the 15th, there were different accounts. We heard one account of Olivier and Graham heading down to catch the 9 o'clock train from Bayeux on a motorbike.
Yeah,
which
sounded very dubious.
Yeah, I would tend to favour 2 bicycles staying apart at a reasonable distance, because once you hit the main road to Bayeux and you're entering Bayeux, which is going to have a German presence, and indeed the accounts relate that when they got to the train station on the 15th for the 9 o'clock train, the station was swarming with Germans. Of course, this is the train route to Paris, but it's also the train route to Cherbourg, where there would have been a heavy presence in 1940.
Key route, yep.
And Graham was told to stand back, keep a distance from Olivier. Olivier bought a one-way ticket to Lisu, which he discreetly then passed to Graham. Graham had been instructed to wait for the signal from Septime Human, who had been told about by his physical appearance, and then board the train, but keep a distance from Septime Human. And not make any gestures, just keep an eye on Septime, maybe and get off the train with him in Lisu, which was a 1-hour 20 train ride. One can only imagine the claustrophobia of that 1-hour 20 train ride full of German troops on the train, which was actually going to Paris. Graham apparently surrounded himself literally with one of those old newspapers which we used to call broadsheets. Olivier bought him a newspaper in which Graham hid himself basically until
well, let's pick up the story of Lisu when we a little bit later, because I want to bring Helen in now, because when we were talking about this, Nigel, this seems a very slick operation, doesn't it, Helen? Really, I mean, you're talking about rural France, farm. They seem to go about a very professional way of getting this guy back. So I can't help but think that there wasn't some intended rendezvous at Anya. He was either very, very lucky to meet exactly the right person, because you could knock on any kind of farm and meet someone who has no idea what to do, no idea. But he seems to know. He seems to fall on his feet. The way the French move Graham around, Helen, does that sound like the thing that MI9 might have been involved setting up in? It sounds very professional to me.
Yeah, it is. But what's interesting, it's very similar to how any of the networks operated. So without seeing, and I don't know whether you have or whether it survives, his escape report, because of course, I actually don't know the fate of Hayes. I haven't studied him myself.
He doesn't make it. So,
sorry, say that again?
He doesn't make it. No. So
okay.
Nigel will do that. So, yeah, there's no... Well, and unless any of the French people he connected on the way. I mean, we'll let Nigel carry with the story in a minute. But, this stage now, the way the French move in with the distance on bicycles don't make it, that seems very slick. Because when I'm thinking about what you said earlier about the MI9 training these commandos to kind of keep calm and try and act professionally. The French seem to be, I'm repeating myself, very, very professional in this. So I'm wondering whether he'd been sent somewhere to particularly get involved with a line that may have already been previously set up by somebody or someone.
Yeah, well, two things to say here. First, I suppose, is to reiterate what was said earlier. Certainly, when I looked at Operation Frankton at Bordeaux, the commandos were, put limpet mines on the German ships, cargo ships there.
Yeah.
The two that get back, if they survive, and it was and they knew, those men, the same with Aquatint, because I studied one of the Aquatint men, the Richard Leninger, the Czech. They knew they actually might not survive. I mean, the chances of survival were slim, but they were told if they did, in the case of the Bordeaux one, they were to go to Ruffec. And I think, I haven't looked at the escape of the Aquatint stuff. I probably should now, because it's just fascinating where they were told to make for. But in terms of the technique, I interviewed one of the last surviving members of the Comet line which ran from Belgium through Paris down to the Pyrenees. And it was exactly as you said. They had to do as they were told. In fact, MI9 said to all personnel, actually, not just the commandos, when they went into action, if you're picked up by helpers and guides or an escape line, you are to treat them as your commanding officer and you are to obey their orders, which is fascinating because they're civilians.
Yeah.
And one of the things, you're right, he was told to follow, Graham Hayes was told to follow. And I have this story in my head of one of those men that was following Elsie Marshall, and they were not allowed to talk to them. You follow me just a few steps behind, a few steps back. You don't say a word until I turn around to speak to you, and you do not light a cigarette. Just little things like this.
Yeah, no, this is really intriguing because, and I knew we wouldn't conclude half. We're talking about a subject that there's some information about, but tantalizingly not enough of the right thing. And every little story you investigate, you realize there's a whole more layer of detail you go into. But so Nigel, he gets them to Lisu, and I'm conscious of the fact we're already 35 minutes in.
I know.
So we're enjoying ourselves, but kind of not too briefly, but briefly-ish.
I know.
Go through the next phase of what happened to him in Lisu.
I can't believe the time already.
I know, it's crazy, isn't it?
I'll just add quickly, there were apparently no roadblock checks on the road to Bayeux, on the bicycle road to Bayeux, and no checks at the Bayeux train station. The same happened in Lisu. When they got off the train at Lisu, Graham followed Septime Human, who was part of the Jean-Marie Action Donkey Man network, out of the station. There were no roadblocks checking people leaving Lisu. Human was going to take Hayes to the safe house of his colleague and member of the same network, Jean-Marie Action Buckmaster, Donkey Man, in Le Pin, which is 9 miles outside of Bayeux. I can't work out if they went there on foot. That's a long walk. 9 miles. Do you follow the roads? There were no road checks apparently. And Lisu is a big town. No roadblock checks. There's no reference to a car yet. I'll come to Dr. Huttershaw shortly, who had a car. And if you've got a car in occupied Normandy in 1942, you're kind of visible. So that's a long walk to get to 9 miles to this house. And Le Pin, this house is in a very secluded spot. The owners at the second attempt very kindly let me in to take a good picture of the property. It was the house belonging to Suzanne Setavaux, member of the resistance in the Pays d'Auge area around Lisu, which was an important network. Also there, Emmanuel Desgeorges, her nephew, who was also part of the network. A very secluded part of the region, just outside of Lisu, but 9 miles. I still can't quite get my head around how they got there. And then Septime Human went back to Waymonde. It's just an extraordinary journey, but there's no details there. But Hayes was there for 6 weeks, and during the time he had a light facial wound, but he also had a leg wound, I think, from the raid. he started to receive the visit of Dr. Paul Woodadge, who was the head of the Reaction document network in the Pays d'Auge area. And we've got a picture of Paul somewhere. No, there he is at the bottom. Paul Woodadge.
I can't find it now. Where the hell am I?
With the glasses. You not got it?
That's Robert
Okay.
Douin, isn't it?
Hmm?
That's Robert Douin, yeah? No?
No, a bit above him.
I can't see it. I'm blind.
Look. Never mind.
Never mind.
Okay, so Paul Woodadge was a doctor who had his surgery in Ferlax, just south of Lisu. He had become the head of the Reaction document network in the Pays d'Auge area, which, from what I've found, had 15 teams of 12 across the area. That number's about 180. Small teams across quite a large area. Pays d'Auge, not just Lisu. They're attached to SOE, the Document Bookmaster Network. And during that it was also the 6 weeks duration he was there. It was also, I think, for them to give time to know what to do next, which was to move him on, which ultimately was about moving him to Paris through the contact we'll come to in a moment, and then to Spain. But that's, of course, when things are going to start to go wrong. So shall I move to what happened in Lisu 6 weeks later?
I'm conscious. I think I want to bring Helen, because we've got a lot to. We could even, because Helen has to go after sort of an hour, so Nigel, I could carry on and finish the story afterwards, couldn't we? Really, so, because the 6 weeks while he's in Lisu, the key thing is the Commando Order has now come in, isn't it? That's now been established. So not that they would have known that, but things are going to be changing behind the scenes. So in terms of I know we haven't finished off the Graham Hayes story, but did things like Aquatint and Dieppe change how MI9 had to approach things from then on? Because there's a new chapter now we're not going to be back into France until D-Day, and that's 2 years away. So what were the main changes MI9 introduced post Commando Order?
If I think about it, I can't think of anything specific that they brought in. I think what's interesting is that the training, apart from being specific to changing with areas and intelligence coming out from escapers and evaders, that as far as I can tell, there is no change to its basic training. And that might sound, unless you've come across something that...
No, not particularly. No, I mean...
I haven't. But what was interesting, the one thing that does come to mind is that around D-Day itself, there is concern for all POWs and those that are evading capture, those that are still in hiding just prior to D-Day, and with the fierce fighting after D-Day, that Hitler will actually start killing POWs, whether they're commandos or not. And there was a various covert operations, of which the giant of MI9, of course, one of the giants, Airi Neve, was involved in at that time. But I'm not sure if you want me to talk about that. But I think really MI9 was focused on getting the intelligence out on curfews, on train timetables, again, tons of snippets of information which could be important to anyone who would find themselves trapped in occupied Europe. So my reading of the stuff that I've done from those vast files is that the basics were the basics for everyone.
So in a sense, what you're saying is the techniques didn't change, but the finesse of them perhaps improved. They had a little bit more information, a little bit more about giving some specific advice. And I mean, let's take forward to perhaps 2 years later when you have the SAS missions and things like Bull Basket, those type of things. So you're thinking that those kind of men would have had the same kind of briefing the Aquatint guys would have been given, but with slightly more layers of information, just a little bit more learning. The learning curve has been going up, so therefore they can offer more information. Is that what we're kind of saying?
Yes. And so what I discovered in my research for my book on MI9 was that MI9 is not only involved in escape and evasion, but it's a vast intelligence gathering organization. So from those that make it back to England, and whether they're POWs or evaders, or whether they are important members and guides and leaders of the escape lines that had to be smuggled out down those same escape lines, MI9 is collecting vast snippets of information. And I'll give you one tangible example, because again, I think that might be helpful. Please. So the port of Danzig, one of the prisoners comes out through the port of Danzig and is smuggled onto a neutral ship to Sweden, makes it out. And when he gets back, he starts to talk about, you know, he draws the port, and MI9 says, well, you know, what did you observe? And to us, it might seem very basic and very, very flippant. But he said, well, there are a couple of quite large bushes just over here, and you can hide behind there because they're big enough, but also the searchlights only come to here. You know, he drew on the plan. So MI9 marked those bushes on one of their escape maps that they then subsequently issued. Now, that might seem the minutest of detail, but that's the level we're talking about. And then, of course, MI9 is also taking from prisoners and evaders information on German defences, so military stuff as well, what they've observed. So it's a massive operation, and no information is wasted.
Now, that all makes sense. I think, again, we're going to go back to the beginning again, because when I contacted you about doing this show, of course, you've already written about one of the other members of the Aquatint team, and I think we should have you go back and tell some of that story as well, because, and you mentioned him earlier on, that's Leonard. So just for that to go back, then we'll go back to Nigel. So to explain about how you came across his story and how that fit into things, because you have his letters home and things. So explain who he is and what happened to him, and it's an incredible story.
Yeah, so I've been doing research for the last 15, 20 years on the 10,000 Germans who fought for Britain. 90% of them were Jewish, of course, and they then start doing all sorts of special operations behind enemy lines, not just for SOE. But Richard Leninger was actually a Czech refugee, and I came across his story through his daughter, because the mother was, he never saw his daughter. His mother was, his wife, mother was pregnant. And of course, baby was born after he died. So Richard Leninger came from Czechoslovakia. He'd actually served in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War. So he was older. And he's transferred, once he's in Britain and war's broken out, to the Pioneer Corps, which is the only unit he's allowed to serve in. And then he's headhunted and trains at Anderson Manor for the small-scale raiding force, and he accompanies the Aquatint raid because he is fluent in German. And he doesn't survive, as we know, but if it's possible, there's just a paragraph of his, not his whole last letter. I want to read it because I don't think it's ever been read before.
Brilliant.
And the family, the daughter, Irene, bless her, it was a big thing to publish this letter because it's so, so personal. And he knew that he might not survive. So the extract, he says, "This is not intended as a letter of farewell, just a reminder of me in case you do not hear from me anymore. It is possible that I could be taken prisoner." His wife doesn't know where he's going, by the way, has no idea he's even in this raiding force. In which case you'll be able to find out about me, name and address to which to write. It may be years before we both see each other again, but I do want you to know that I shall do my utmost to return to you both. And he's talking about his wife and the baby in the womb. And then there's a bit more of the letter. And then he says, and this is the last bit, "I cannot say that I'm pleased to be going, but I am proud that I'm one of the ones selected to do something that might end the war sooner. And now, darling, a very big request." Oh God, I always get emotional at this point. "If I should die," what a horrible word, he says, "do not change your demeanour." He doesn't want her to spend her lifetime weeping for him. "Do not change your demeanour in front of the child in any way. I believe a child understands far more of such things than we imagine. We are working for a better future for our child and a better life for mankind." I think this is really at the heart of this raid, you know. It's millions are dying in Russia, Why should I be the exception? Please tell our child someday that I did what I thought was right. And that probably sums up, you know, the sacrifice of all of those men in the Aquatint raid.
And I think it's also a very, thank you for reading it, by the way, but it also reminds us that in our kind of studious attempt to kind of find out why did they go that way, which way that way, we've got the heart of it is very, very brave individuals doing something very, very extraordinary to try and make the world a better place. In our first show, those who did see the first show, of course, you remember we put poppy crosses on Leonard, March Phillips, and the other guy, Williams, their graves in Saint Laurent-sur-Mer. 78 years on after they were killed, just that same night. That was we had the torch there, and we put the crosses there, and that was a moving moment there. So
yes.
you know that's the thing. You know, we're trying. You have to wear different hats because you know you're researching things to try and understand how do they do this, but at the same time, incredibly brave people doing incredibly brave things. And I think with that's a very good reminder of what these men went through. So. Changing tack again now because I'm aware again of time there. So he didn't make it. Graham Hayes, who was obviously they were friends. He and Leonard were friends, and Leonard had his English name Leonard, and Leninger his Czech name. They were comrades in this team, and there was Legrand, the Frenchman. There was a Pole, and there was a Dutchman. There was a captain. We'll go through that later with Nigel, but it all goes wrong on the beach now. Going back to the lessons that would be learned from things like Aquatint, you said that there weren't any major changes to how MI9 briefed the men, but this is when a mission goes wrong, it must have sent alarm bells back through not just MI9 but SOE and MI6 and the other things there of these things can go wrong, because going wrong also could potentially jeopardize escape lines, and that's the thing that intrigues me is if we think that Graham Hayes had been told to head inland this particular village. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But then he gets captured, and then he reveals about a line he'd been. You're making one disaster is potentially leading to other disasters, because a commando then gets captured, then he ends up giving away an escape line that helps them. So that the knock-on effect is huge, isn't it? So,
yeah, absolutely. And from MI9's perspective, or from the intelligence services generally, these networks, is to get information. Now, I haven't done anything in detail on the French resistance, or even, of course, very little known about the SIS networks, but it would be a logical thing. And I do in my book say that sometimes the lines between SIS/MI6 and MI9 are blurred and very close. And it wouldn't be unreasonable to think that both MI9 and MI6 would try to get information out from behind enemy lines on exactly who has survived. Well, they know they haven't survived. The question is, have any of them been captured? Have any of them made it and are evading capture? But again, we haven't really got the trail, have we, from the other end, from those that sheltered Hayes? It would have been a very long time before they could have given any information, presumably, to the Allies, unless, again, they were able to smuggle coded letters out, and that's something we might never know.
Yeah, and that's that whole thing that no matter how much you know, you realize how much you don't know, and how there's another whole raft of stuff that could involve that could be investigated and go into. But before, because you'll have to go in a minute, and I'll carry on with Nigel about Graham Hayes, and you could catch up and find out yourself if you come back and watch the show yourself. But in your research, and your book is incredible, by the way. But what kind of emotional burden do you think the planners, the guys who never left the UK, who are having to set up these lines, and I mean, Air and Neve, of course, famously got back, but do you think having to manage these lines took an emotional toll on these guys, the people planning it? Because if someone gets captured, there's torture. This is a very horrible thing you're dealing with. What between the lines, when you're looking at the archives, what do you make of these people who are operating there? How did they cope with just dealing with that potential tragedy all the time, day to day, as your daily job?
Yeah, so in a sense, we don't have, like, you've got the very emotional letter from Leninger/Leonard.
Yeah.
We don't really have anything from the vast majority of the MI9 officers, men and women, that were working from MI9 side, except, of course, the books by Airy Neve and Foote and Langley, for example.
Yeah.
And although it's not in relation to Aquatint, Neve at one point in particular is pained by the way that an agent is sent into Holland, Terwind, also codenamed Felix, Beatrice, and she's captured immediately, like they were in France, you know. But she was dropped in not with SOE, but as an agent of MI9, which is fascinating, totally different. And it pained Neve, and he said he didn't want to send another agent for MI9, female agent, behind enemy lines. And yes, it was a reality, but I think it was because of the horrific nature of the torture. And we did have information coming back from the escape lines, and including in the areas we're talking about now, information coming back that helpers, guides, etc., were being sent to concentration camps. Some of them weren't even surviving. They were being shot, and their families, for helping the Allies. So MI9 was very aware of the risks. And one of the most important things, and this is something which the commandos on Aquatint would have been told, they are risking their lives for you. So if you are ever, if you make it, or if you survive the raid and you're evading capture, under no circumstances must you ever to anybody else reveal who's helped you in the chain, not even to the third person on, if you like.
Yeah.
Because, within the commander case in 42, we know it's different because they were going to be shot. But until then, MI9 said, you'll be treated as prisoners of war and you're likely to survive. They will not. And so MI9 was very much a guardian of human life and the sanctity of human life, but with a reality of the losses as well. Yeah. And so that's probably about as much as we can say without any surviving letters and testimonies, which of course could still come to light.
It's like that the letter you read there. I mean, Leonard Leninger knows that whatever happens to him, his wife and child to be will be safe. They are not going to get. Whereas a French person, a young French person who's bravely helping, and we'll go into Nigel's story, leading someone to a train station, if it goes wrong for them, it could mean curtains for them, curtains for their father, their mother, their sisters, their brothers, their neighbors. That the net could so it's not just one life, is it? Whereas a commando knows exactly what he's taking on board, and we've done shows with Damien Lewis. We're talking about that particular type of person that becomes a commando, the Paddy Mayne kind of SAS guy, the do or die kind. They can risk their own lives, but they're risking the lives of their men, but they've all absolutely signed up for that. And until the Commando Order, they know theoretically they'll be treated as prisoners of war. And even after Commando Order, most captured allies were treated as POWs. Most. I'm not going to go off on the occasions that they weren't, but generally they were. But for the people, the civilians involved, of course, the repercussions are much more dangerous. We'll talk about Mont Valérien in Paris with Nigel in a minute, but I'm aware that you're going to have to go in a minute, Helen. So I can't believe how the time has flown on this. It's just, it's been extraordinary. But I'm going to let you go now, Helen, because you've got things to do. So for those watching, MI9, the other books about the German intelligence, the Wolves Have Ears, they're all incredibly good books. And you have a very busy schedule right now. You're doing podcasts and lectures and things all the time, Helen. So thank you very much for taking the time to join us on our humble little channel here. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And come back and watch it to find out what happens to Graham Hayes, really, because Nigel's done some extraordinary work. And with hindsight, we might have done a special just about Graham Hayes. It's that whole rabbit hole thing is that every single person who served in World War II, there's a book about them you could do, isn't it? And a show. So there's never enough time. Anyway, thank you very much, Helen, for joining me. I will let you go, and we'll carry on with Nigel.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Take
care,
Helen. I'll drop you out the meeting. Thank you. Bye. Right. So sorry, folks. Not sorry, folks. I'm enjoying it. I'm learning a lot from this, and so we're going to carry on now with Nigel about what happened to Graham Hayes in Lisieux. So he ended up in the Le Clos de Pin in Lisieux, and he was there for 6 weeks. So take us up the story from there, Nigel. And there is a sad ending, folks. So I think it's, that's fairly obvious now. But yeah, explain what happened next.
Well, during the time, though, he received regular visits in Le Pin from, that's the house of Suzanne Seteville and Emmanuel de Georges, from Dr. Paul Woodadge, who was one of the rare people to be seen regularly in the area driving his Simca car with his house space. And the two apparently got on very well, Woodadge and Hayes. Eventually, the day came where Hayes would be transferred to Lisieux for the train to Paris. That was set up October the 20th. And Dr. Paul Woodadge came to pick up Hayes that day and Suzanne Seteville to take them to the Cathedral Square in Lisieux, where they arrived at 8 o'clock in the morning. We've got a picture of the square maybe somewhere there.
Just bear with me. Hang on. Yeah.
Cathedral.
Hang on. I was trying to get the Paul. Hang on. We just get the cathedral one. Hang on, Mike. Just carry on the stuff. My computer's playing up with me. Just give me a second.
Woodadge dropped them off at around about 8 o'clock. It was market day. It was still quiet at that point. It was getting busier. They were supposed to meet two men of the network who were going to take Hayes to the train station, 15 minutes walk from there, and take him to Paris to a new safe house before he was to be moved to the Spanish border. So if we've got the picture of Lisieux, is it?
Right, that's the town one. Is that the one you want?
That's all right. Well, that's the other. That's 180 degrees around from the cathedral. They didn't turn up until after 9 o'clock, so they missed it. Suzanne was panicking at this point. Sent Graham into the cathedral. They knew they'd missed the train. There you go. That's where they were waiting. 180 degrees turn around, and you get the street, which of course Lisieux's been heavily rebuilt.
Yeah.
After the war, they arrived at after 9 o'clock. Robert Goubot and Robert Kiefer, and took Graham, much to Suzanne's relief, probably anger that they were so late, towards the train station for the next train to Paris, which was at 10:27. That was actually the moment where Graham was being taken into the hands of the German Abwehr, because Kiefer and Goubot were both sub-agents, infiltrated the resistance, working for Hugo Bleicher, who we'll come to in a moment, for the Abwehr. So that was the moment that Hayes fell into the hands of the Germans, because Kiefer, who unfortunately we don't have a picture of, there's not too much information about Goubot, but Kiefer, he had been part of the Inter-Allié Franco-Polish network, which had been dismantled in 1941. And after several weeks incarceration, interrogated by Hugo Bleicher, had been turned to become in fact, he was turned on November the 14th, 1941.
There's Hugo Bleicher.
There's Bleicher. So when they got to Paris on October the 20th, Bleicher was there, introduced to Hayes as Monsieur Paul, and apparently Kiefer said to Hayes, "This man organized everything." I'll just quote. After the war, Bleicher's superior said this of him: "That man with black spectacles who never opened his mouth. I had initially recruited him as an interpreter at the GFP, but I rapidly realized he had the potential to become an unrivaled auxiliary for our department in the Abwehr. He is extraordinarily intelligent, with nerves of steel. He is a cold, calculating man who never misjudges emotion. From behind his dark glasses, he is capable of reading the most secret of thoughts, and men become as malleable as wax in his hands. He never drinks, but smokes alarming numbers of cigarettes and endless coffee. A tireless worker, fatigue has no effect on him." Bleicher was ruthless in his dismantling of networks across France. He has set up Kiefer as a liaison between Paris and the Normandy networks as a sub-agent. On the other side of the coin, Henri Frager had instructed Paul Woodadge who met Kiefer in the spring of 1942, that he
I've got
was
the
in
Paul
fact a
photo now,
liaison. There
finally.
it is. So Horseshoe, as of spring 42, well before Aquatint, believed the contrary, that Kiefer was a liaison officer between Paris and the Pays d'Auge region for the Jean-Marie Donkeyman network. So basically, as soon as Hayes had arrived in Le Pen, Kiefer was aware of this, and Bleicher was preparing the plans for what was going to happen next, which of course happened when he fell into the hands in Lisu. So when they got to Lisu, when they got to Paris, having briefly met Bleicher, of course Hayes didn't know his true identity yet. A man called Jean-Louis Horthy, another French resistance turncoat sub-agent for the Aviators, took him to a house in Garches, about 1 hour in the Parisian suburbs, to wait for the next move. Whilst in Garches, Horthy, Jean-Louis Horthy's house, introduced Hayes to an Englishwoman called Winifred Davidson, which gave Hayes some relief, of course, to communicate with someone in his own language. There, Hayes wrote on October the 27th letters which were sent through Davidson to the Red Cross, which eventually reached England in June 1943, I think, stating that he was alive and well, which was, as of that date, October the 27th. So his parents believed that as of that date, he was alive and well, but of course, very shortly, it was not to be the case. What happened? Beyond that, the dates as to what happened moving Paris to Spain is very vague what actually happened. There's no date as to when he was transferred by train with Horthy, Jean-Louis Horthy, to Spain by train. It appears they went by train, not across the escape lines across the mountains. Whether or not it was before Torch or after Torch, I don't know.
We don't know, do we?
But, the Spanish guards, from what we know, appear to have handed over Hayes back across the border, and Hayes was then brought back to the prison in Fresnes, in the Parisian suburbs. So there's a big question mark about what's going on in that period. Why go to all the effort of taking him on a long journey with Horthy, unless it's to gain more information and keep it stretched out to get more break-ins to the network? I don't know. But what happened then is Hayes was put into 8 months of solitary confinement. We know from an RAF prisoner of war by the name of Evans, who was in a prison cell adjacent to Hayes in the Fresnes prison, that they developed a good rapport, Hayes and Evans, by tapping Morse on the plumbing and the pipes of the prison cells. And Evans later, who survived the war, would relate to Hayes's parents how Hayes had really given great moral support to Evans to get him through the ordeal of confinement. And then suddenly, in the summer of 1943, there was no longer any tapping on the pipes. Hayes, presumably, Evans believed, had been moved to a POW camp, but he had in fact been executed on July the 13th. Presumably, I mean, there's one point I missed. It's probably likely that Bleicher, when Hayes was brought back to Paris, made it clear to Hayes who he really was, and probably informed him that letters, Hayes had also written letters in Paris that he'd given to Horthy, and Horthy said he would give them to all his friends in Normandy, which was basically sealing the fate of all the people that helped him in Normandy, and we used them in what would happen in the roundups that would follow, which we'll come to in the conclusion. The execution of Graham Hayes. This is the report which was found. Is that Mont Valérien?
Yeah, it's obviously for folks watching this. That's not going to be Graham Hayes there, but that's Mont Valérien, which is a sort of a fortress just outside Paris. There's an American cemetery just down the road as well. Mag and I went there last year.
Yes, Suresnes.
1,018 French and other suspected, criminals, terrorists, resistance were shot at this particular place in Paris. And that are the shootings in World War II. And I'll just show the photo of what the monument is like there. If you do find yourselves in Paris when travel is possible, it's definitely a monument worth going up to. You go down the train and walk up a hill, and it's there's a little museum there that wasn't open when we were there, but it lists a lot of the people who were killed and shot there. And
British authorities apparently informed Hayes's parents that that was the likely location where he'd been killed. This is the death sentence, the report of the death sentence, which was found in Potsdam at the end of the war on Hayes. The death sentence was pronounced against Captain Graham Hayes, born 9th of July 1914 in Leeds. Hayes landed close to Cherbourg with a relatively large group of commandos on the 13th of September 1942. As he retreated, his boat was destroyed. He swam back to the beach and remained in hiding in a month in civilian clothing among the French. Next bit is where it changes: engaging in spying activities, collecting information on possible landing zones, and looking for recruit agents. He was followed by one of our agents and was unmasked. He was arrested in Paris on the 28th of October 1942. On the 22nd of February 1943, he was condemned to death by the commanding court in Paris. The sentence was executed on the 13th of July 1943. And there you've just shown his Commonwealth War Graves Commission certificate. And there he is. What was it, age 29? And the tragic coincidence of Graham's execution on July the 13th was that his good friend Geoffrey Appleyard, who by this point had been transferred to Second SAS, part of the Operation Husky operations in Sicily, was on a plane that had been shot down on the same day.
Same day, yeah.
We've got his certificate as well, and he's a memorial. He's listed as in the memorial at Casino Cemetery in Italy.
Yeah, that's extraordinary, isn't it?
From the good friends, the same village in North Yorkshire, and they both died the same day in different circumstances. Incredible.
There's Appleyard certificate there as well.
There we are. And there is a memorial in Linton to them and others, made out of wood that Graham had used in his love of woodwork before.
And this is where we're going to bring the connection between yourself and Graham Hayes is this sort of artistic side. You know, you're a painter and an artist and what have you, and Graham Hayes was tell us the story. I haven't got the image ready, but he embroidered a little a tapestry thing, didn't he, while he was in Lisu, we think.
Well, he obviously like craft, and he was involved. He enjoyed wood carving apparently before the war. And during his time in hiding in Normandy, he made an embroidery, which I tried to find the location of. I think his parents gave it after the war to Isabel de Branville. Where it is now, I don't know. But he made an embroidery stitch, which depicted, during his time hiding in Normandy, which depicted a German soldier being rammed. And Graham was depicting himself as a black crow or a raven on a branch looking down at this ramming of a German soldier to pass the time. You know, we talk about lockdown, but what a time for lockdown for him.
Yeah.
Not knowing where he was. And that was a drawing I made of Graham in 2014 for a good friend, Pascal Vanier, a journalist who did a very short video, a number of videos of all of the different raids that took place along the French coast before D-Day, right from 1941 right through to the events of the greatest of them all on June 6th. Should I just go over what happened to some of the names I've mentioned? Yeah,
for those watching, I know we've kind of gone off down some quite important detail here, but that's the interesting thing about this. You know, one raid that people know very little about, and you realize there's all these stories and routes you can go down. So Helen told us Leonard Leninger, the Czech, he was killed Well, March Phillips and Williams were killed on the beach on September the 12th under gunfire. There's some question about how Leonard died. In that he seems to have survived initial conflict, but then being taken through Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, there's something that happens and the Germans shoot him. There's a suggestion that he kind of he identified who he was or something. There's different versions of why, but he was killed in Saint-Laurent sometime after. Hayes, we've dealt with him. Appleyard does swim back, gets the MTB, and gets in the SAS where he dies a year later. And then I'll let you take over the other ones. And give each guy a kind of a brief outcome.
Yeah, I'm going to use my notes on this just to get it correct. Okay, just to get it correct instead of doing it off the top, just to do it well. Three escaped: Burton, Orr, Hellings. They were captured 3 days later and taken to, apart from Hull and Howard, were taken to Rennes, dispatched to POW camps in Germany. Howard was granted sanitary repatriation to the UK via Sweden, where he recovered from gangrene. Howard returned to Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer in 1986 and died in 1999. Tony Hull returned to England at the end of the war. He remained disabled from his wounds under the Aquatint raid for the rest of his life and suffering regular epilepsy. John Burton remained a POW until the end of the war. He then went to the Pacific at the time of the Japanese surrender. He returned to England in 1946, but then retired to South Africa, where he died in 1985. Tom Winter was sent to a POW camp in Poland. In the camp, Stalag 18B, he worked in the Red Cross Postal Office, where he established communication with the Polish resistance. He was marched to Germany with the other prisoners as the Red Army advanced and was sent to Stalag 11 near Bergen-Belsen. There, Winters managed to escape and succeeded in reaching Allied lines. He served as a guide in the advancing British Army. He returned to Saint-Laurent, last surviving member of the raid, in 1994, the 50th anniversary. 52nd for Aquatint, died in 1996, just afterwards. The fate of Adam Orr, born as Abraham Obczynski, is uncertain. No one involved in Aquatint saw him alive after he and Winter were separated when they reached Germany. The historian Mike Langley, who researched Aquatint, found his grave in Dernbach in 1986. The grave of Orr states he died in April 1945. Most of the graves in the Dernbach Commonwealth plot are RAF shot down during bombing raids. About 30 are Polish who were detainees in the area. Dernbach is south of Munich, of course, which was Dachau, but more likely, this is possible, Dernbach is very close to an SS factory where they use slave labor. That holds. That's hypothesis, of course. Finally, Jan Hellings was last seen in Frankfurt by Winter. What happened to him was unknown, but I made a small paper. I wrote a small paper for the Combined Ops website many years ago. There was an addition made to it several years ago from Jan Hellings' son, who said that he survived the war and retired to live in South Africa.
Right.
The French naval officer André Desgrange, he escaped from captivity and succeeded in returning to England. After the war, he returned to France and settled in Angers, in the Loire area. He died in 1990, having retired to the south of France. Appleyard and Hayes, of course, was.
So, we'll bring things to a conclusion, and I know we're talking about just a dozen men, and some of my Battlefield live streams you talk about entire operations involving 3 or 4 divisions where hundreds are killed and thousands are wounded and taken prison. We've just focused on not even 20 people, but these guys, they are part of the people that paved the way for the successful Operation Overlord and the successful operations later on, and the role of MI9 and these other organizations to try and save as many lives as possible is something that can never be ignored. And thank you very much, Nigel, for your work.
We should add, though, that Paul, the people that helped
yes,
to end, because all these French people that helped Hayes, Paul Hottershaw ended up dying in Buchenwald concentration camp.
Yeah, no, that's and that's what we said to Helen, isn't it? Is that some of these guys who were captured, they were just you know, into prison war camps and survived the war. If you're French and you're helping, that's it. Buchenwald. It's the very different outcome.
Yeah.
And you know, the French and Belgian agents and people who helped are very important. But of course, there's this dark side. The Kiefer guy who ends up betraying people. And there's also an article, I found it not long ago, André de Grange. There's a suggestion that he was a turncoat as well at some point during the war, which goes against, you know, think, well, you know, what evidence is there for that? I don't know. It's the complexity of it all. That's something I found where some guy's written saying he was one of the I don't know. Allegedly, I'll use the word allegedly there, but
well, maybe the complexities of Kiefer getting his amnesty after being sentenced to death. Maybe that's another.
We can go down that and talk about. Anyway, the point is this. We've highlighted some of these incredible people there, and it's, I think, a fitting way to end this Operation Aquatint 3-part series about. It's just one little mission, and as we were saying to Helen, every one of these stories, there's rabbit holes off down there. There's a spider's web of further stories and further investigation to be done, and this we will never. I don't think we'll ever know whether Hayes had gone to Anier deliberately or whether it was accidental. I mean, as we speculated during the program, the way the French handled him seems very slick, and maybe they are part of some.
Isabel did join the network shortly afterwards.
Yeah.
So there is a link there.
There's a link there. It's fascinating. Anyway, in terms of to bring the program, if Nigel is also an author as well, there's a great book, a guide to the cemeteries in Normandy war cemeteries that I flashed up image there, which is a nice little handy fit in your backpack. Just tells you where they all are, how to get them all to all of them, and what, you know, the key features of them. That's worth getting. Check out his website, his art, and what have you, and lectures for cruise ships, things like that. So that's that. So yeah, it remains for me to say thank you very much to Helen, who's already departed, and she has to get involved in a veteran friend of hers has passed away. She's going to be involved in commemorating that late. That's why she had to go. Nigel has stayed with me. In terms of what we've got coming up next week, on the 17th, we're talking about Churchill's secret army in England, the resistance network to deal with the Germans should the Germans have successfully invaded the UK. I'm very excited to be able to announce some of the comic book shows we've got coming up. We've got some incredible guests coming up for that. Writers of some legendary World War II comics, both British and American. I'm excited about that. We got our 2 shows next Saturday. I haven't listed them on YouTube yet, but I will do very shortly. 2 shows bringing you live images from Volgograd, or Stalingrad as it was called back then. Then on Sunday, we've got Joris and Edwin are streaming from the Netherlands, Operation Pegasus. So although we're locked down here in France, we're taking advantage of people who aren't locked down. So there are still some Battlefield live streams coming up. So I'm working, as I have been, sort of 60, 70 hours a week trying to put this stuff together, prepping and reading books. The pile of books by my bed to read is starting to block the sunlight from the window now, but there you go. So again, it remains me to say thank you very much to Nigel and Helen. If you have been watching this, enjoy it. Don't forget to click subscribe, share your videos with people, and please check out our Patreon page and consider becoming a patron so you can help support these shows. So
thanks for having me.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Thanks very much, everyone, for watching. So I'll end the stream now. So we'll see you all again next week when we talk about Churchill's secret commandos. So thanks for watching. I'm Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. Check us out on Patreon. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon. Bye, everybody.